We are in Genesis 26 today. Genesis 26. Have you ever had the sense of deja vu? Deja vu, by the way, is that feeling that you've been there, done that before. It's French for already seen. Logically, you know you haven't experienced this moment before, but your brain is telling you otherwise. So have you had that feeling of deja vu before? I have. In fact, earlier this morning, I was getting up ready to preach, and suddenly I was like, I feel like I've already preached this sermon before, so this is just recent. Well, whether you have or haven't had that feeling, you're about to have one. Let's look at chapter 26. I'm going to read starting at verse 1. Now there was a famine in the land, besides the former famine that was in the days of Abraham. And Isaac went to Gerar to Abimelech, king of the Philistines. And the Lord appeared to him and said, Do not go down to Egypt. Dwell in the land of which I shall tell you. Sojourn in this land, and I will be with you and will bless you. For to you and to your offspring I will give all these lands, and I will establish the oath that I swore to Abraham your father. I will multiply your offspring as the stars of heaven, and will give to your offspring all these lands. And in your offspring all the nations of the earth shall be blessed, because Abraham obeyed my voice, and kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, and my laws. So Isaac settled in Gerar. When the men of the place asked him about his wife, he said, She is my sister. For he feared to say, my wife, thinking, lest the men of the place should kill me because of Rebekah, because she was attractive in appearance. When he had been there a long time, Abimelech, king of the Philistines, looked out of the window and saw Isaac laughing with Rebekah, his wife. So Abimelech called Isaac and said, Behold, she is your wife. How then could you say, She is my sister? Isaac said to him, Because I thought, lest I die because of her. Abimelech said, What is this you have done to us? One of the people might easily have lain with your wife, and you would have brought guilt upon us. So Abimelech warned all the people, saying, Whoever touches this man or his wife shall surely be put to death. And Isaac sowed in that land and reaped in that same year 100-fold. The Lord blessed him. And the man became rich and gained more and more until he became very wealthy. He had possessions of flocks and herds and many servants, so that the Philistines envied him. Now the Philistines had stopped and filled with earth all the wells that his father's servants had dug in the days of Abraham his father. And Abimelech said to Isaac, Go away from us, for you are much mightier than we. So Isaac departed from there and encamped in the valley of Gerar and settled there. And Isaac dug up again the wells of water that had been dug in the days of Abraham his father, which the Philistines had stopped after the death of Abraham. And he gave them the names that his father had given them. But when Isaac's servants dug in the valley and found there a well of spring water, the herdsmen of Gerar quarreled with Isaac's herdsmen, saying, That water is ours. So he called the name of the well Esek, because they contended with him. Then they dug another well, and they quarreled over that also. So he called its name Sitnah. And he moved from there and dug another well, and they did not quarrel over it. So he called its name Rehoboth, saying, For now the Lord has made room for us, and we shall be fruitful in the land. From there he went up to Beersheba, and the Lord appeared to him that same night and said, I am the God of Abraham your father. Fear not, for I am with you, and will bless you, and multiply your offspring for my servant Abraham's sake. So he built an altar there, and called upon the name of the Lord, and pitched his tent there. And there Isaac's servants dug a well. When Abimelech went to him from Gerar with Ahuzath, his advisor, and Phicol, the commander of his army, Isaac said to them, Why have you come to me, seeing that you hate me and have sent me away from you? They said, We see plainly that the Lord has been with you. So we said, Let there be a sworn pact between us, between you and us, and let us make a covenant with you, that you will do us no harm, just as we have not touched you and have done to you nothing but good, and have sent you away in peace. You are now the blessed of the Lord." So he made them a feast, and they ate and drank. In the morning they rose early and exchanged oaths, and Isaac sent them on their way, and they departed from him in peace. That same day Isaac's servants came and told him about the well that they had dug, and said to him, "We have found water." He called it Sheba. Therefore the name of the city is Beersheba to this day. When Esau was 40 years old, he took Judith, the daughter of Beeri the Hittite, to be his wife, and Basemath, the daughter of Elon the Hittite, and they made life bitter for Isaac and Rebekah. All right, let's look at some of these deja vu moments. There's a famine in the land. The similarity is already given for us in verse 1. It's just like the days of Abraham. Then Isaac meets someone. Who does he meet? Abimelech. Where have we seen him before? With Abraham. Now, Abimelech could be a royal title, much like Pharaoh is a royal title. Still, I'm inclined to think it's the same person because of what happens next and because of what happens at the end of the chapter. So next, God gives Isaac a covenant. This covenant is the one given to Abraham. And then Isaac settles in Gerar and calls Rebekah his what? His sister. Where have we seen that happen before? Abraham. Twice. The first time was with Pharaoh. The second time was with Abimelech. We'll talk more about that in a moment. Who finds out about Isaac's lie? Abimelech. Yeah, and he makes sure that no one touches Rebekah. It seems like he's had some experience in this area before. Then Isaac moves around a little bit. He redigs the wells that his dad had dug. And then in verse 26, who comes out to meet with Isaac? Abimelech. I won't make you pronounce the second one. Ahuzath and Phicol. And what did they want to do? Make a covenant or establish a treaty. And where have we seen that happen before? With Abraham, right? And then the servants come and tell Isaac of a well that they had dug after Abimelech and his commanders leave. Where is that well located? In Beersheba. Yeah. This is the same place that Abraham made the treaty with Abimelech and Phicol before. And after he got done making that treaty, he tells them of a well that his servants had dug. In fact, in both cases, Genesis 21 verse 31 and Genesis 26 verse 33, we're told that these two separate treaties are the reasons why this place is called Beersheba. And in chapter 26, basically what's happening, all these deja vu moments, Isaac is basically retracing Abraham's steps and reliving almost the events of his life. But there are some differences, so let's dig into the meat of this chapter. All right, so verse 1 talks about a famine in the land. Now, because of the similarity of Isaac's situation and Abraham's situation, there's great pains taken here to remind us that this was a different famine from the days of Abraham. And actually, more than a century has passed since that time. Isn't that crazy? A century has passed since Abraham went through a similar situation. And then Abimelech is mentioned here. Now, the common assumption is that Abimelech was a title for all Philistine kings, and that's probably true. Part of the reason for that is that we read about people named Abimelech in later Old Testament books, such as the one connected with David. The other part of the reason is that Genesis 21, the last time we see Abimelech, was 80 years ago. Now, I personally think it's the same Abimelech, and I have 3 reasons for this. First, people lived longer back then. We just talked last week about how Shem was 500 years old and was still alive while these things were going on. And so 80 years doesn't mean that much. for their lifespan back then. Second, in verse 10, Abimelech seemed to be concerned about what would have happened if someone slept with Isaac's wife. Third, when he goes to make a covenant with Isaac, he brings the same commander of his army, Phicol. And finally, he makes the same covenant with Isaac as was made with Abraham. Still, while I think it's the same guy, this all could be explained away by the previous king just telling this king everything that happened with Abraham, and this king learning the lessons that he should learn. So that could account for this too. We really have no way of knowing, nor should I say does it ultimately matter in the scheme of things, but just the similarities I thought I'd draw out. Let's look at verses 2 to 5. God appears to Isaac, and he first warns him not to go to Egypt. Remember that Abraham went to Egypt when there was a famine in the land, and there was nothing good that came out of Egypt from what he did there. And so God renews with Isaac the covenant that he made with Abraham. God promises descendants, he promises land, and he promises to bless Isaac in that land. He promises that the offspring will be blessed. And he says that through his offspring, all the nations will be blessed. Now look at verse 5. Verse 5. Why is God renewing the covenant with Isaac? According to verse 5, why is God renewing the covenant with Isaac? Yeah, because Abraham obeyed. So it's because of the faithfulness of Abraham that God is renewing this covenant with Isaac. Okay, it kind of goes to show that Isaac doesn't necessarily have this well-established integrity or faith or some kind of awesome attribute about him that makes God say, yes, I want you to have this covenant. No, God is still showing grace. Just as he showed grace to Abraham, chose him even though he might not have deserved it. He's doing the same thing for Isaac. He doesn't base his renewal of the covenant in Isaac's worthiness, but just only in his grace. Now, it says in verse 5, because Abraham obeyed my voice and kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, and my laws. So what charge did God give to Abraham? It's the very first thing that God told Abraham. Yeah, the charge that God gave to Abraham was to go to this different land. Okay, that's the charge that he gave him, and Abraham obeyed that. So then he gave him commands too. One command that he gave was to sacrifice his son Isaac. A statute that he gave, a statute is something that stands for a long period of time. A statute that he gave Abraham was to circumcise every male 8 days and older. And then he also gave a law to keep his covenant. So that's what God is talking about here in verse 5. The charge was to go, the command was to sacrifice, the statute was to circumcise, and his law was to keep his covenant. Okay? So God is already giving these things, even before we get to Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, where we tend to talk about the laws that God has for the nation of Israel. God is already giving these types of things to Abraham, just that we wouldn't normally recognize. And it's because Abraham obeyed him and kept these things that God is now going to renew the covenant with Isaac. And so Isaac comes to Gerar in verse 6. And what does he do? What does he do when he gets to Gerar? He just flat out lies, right? He flat out lies. He has the same fear as his dad, and he does the same thing. He calls his wife his sister. Husbands, this isn't a good idea, by the way. Don't learn from this example. And here's something important that we need to understand. Back in Genesis 12, when Abraham did this himself for the first time, we never see him repenting of it. He's chastised, he has to leave, but we never see him repenting of it. And then in Genesis 21, when Abraham does it a second time, he never repented there either. I think that Isaac learned from Abraham's sin and replicated it here. He didn't actually see this happening, but he probably heard the stories. Hey, I went to a foreign place. I was afraid they're going to kill me, so I called my wife my sister. That's what Isaac learned. And that's what happens when unrepentant sin is in a family. When parents sin and make no effort at correcting that sin, confessing it, or repenting it, or even calling it sin, the next generation is more than likely guaranteed to repeat it. This is what is being talked about in the Bible in places such as Numbers 14, verse 18, where it says, "The Lord is slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love, forgiving iniquity and transgression, but he will by no means clear the guilty, visiting the sins of the father on the children to the third and fourth generation." See, even though we are responsible for our own sin, if we do nothing to stop that sin in our lives, it can be passed down generation after generation. In fact, if a sin is habitual and if it's public, it's hard to stop that in one generation. I know of people whose grandparents were maybe alcoholic and abusive, and it passes down to parents and to children and on, because it's hard for that to stop. Sometimes it takes a few generations to completely change it so that it isn't passed down to another generation. So Abraham lies, Isaac lies in the same way, and soon we're going to see Jacob acting as a deceiver quite often. So if there's one thing I want to encourage each of us to do, it's just to confess and repent of sin. If it's public sin, do it publicly to your family so that your sin doesn't pass down to the next generation. Or at the very least, you can begin the process of ending generational sin. All right, there are some differences, though, in the events from in Isaac's events and Abraham's events. So first, with Abraham, there was no famine with Abimelech. The famine happened with Egypt. God said to Isaac, don't go to Egypt because of this famine like Abraham did. So the difference here is that there's no famine with Abimelech. With Isaac, there is. Here, Rebekah stays with Isaac. For Abraham, Sarah goes to Abimelech. Here, there's an accidental discovery on the part of Abimelech. With Abraham, there was a divine intervention. God warns him not to be with Abraham's wife. And here, there is no royal gift given. When Abraham left, Abimelech kind of tried to smooth things over by giving him lots of gifts. Here, Isaac just leaves on his own. Still, Abimelech figures out what's going on and he confronts Isaac. Now, if this is the same Abimelech, I wonder if he purposefully didn't take Rebekah as his wife because he didn't trust Isaac because of his, heritage. Nevertheless, Abimelech ends the confrontation by keeping his people from touching Rebekah. And again, telling them that they would be put to death. I think that may be pointing more to what God would do to them rather than what Abimelech would do to them. Because remember with Abraham, God comes to Abimelech and says, you are a dead man for doing these things. And Abimelech is like, I didn't know what I was doing. Abimelech understood that he would have been killed had he did anything with Sarah. Here he's warning the people of the exact same thing. So, that's all the information coming up through verse 11. Let's look again now at verse 12. Isaac sowed in the land, okay? In this next chunk of verses, we're going to see that God has blessed Isaac. In fact, he blessed him a lot. How much did Isaac reap within the same year at the end of verse 12? 100-fold. Is there a farmer here who would not want to reap 100-fold in the same year? God blessed him abundantly here. It's amazing. Especially since Abraham had become very rich and passed off the bulk of his property to Isaac. Isaac must have been very rich by this point. But God was preparing, right, for the future. At some point, all of this wealth would be passed down, split between Esau and Jacob. And with Jacob specifically, his share would eventually be split into 12 for his sons. But Isaac becomes so wealthy that the Philistines envied him, and Abimelech told him to leave. And so he did. What did he do as he traveled around? Dug wells, yeah. He was digging up the wells that had been filled in after Abraham's death. And then he dug some new wells. The first one is called Esek. This means contention in the Hebrew, a fitting name for the situation that it led to. The second one is called Sitnah. This means hostility in the Hebrew, another appropriate name. And the last one he named Rehoboth. This means broad places in the Hebrew. And what does he say about this well at the end of verse 22? For the Lord has what? Made room for us. So Rehoboth, meaning broad places, corresponds with what he says. God has made room for us. And then from there he went to Beersheba. God appears to him, reaffirms his covenant, states once again that it's for Abraham's sake. And how does Isaac respond? Yeah, he built an altar. This was an act of worship. It was on the altar that sacrifices are given. So Isaac does that, and then he settles there. It says that he pitched his tent there. And then Abimelech comes again with Ahuzath and Phicol. A little different from last time. Ahuzath is new to this situation. He wasn't there with Abraham. And Isaac had a logical question for them. Why come to me since you hate me and sent me away? Of course, Isaac's actions was the reason for their hate. He lied to them. But the three offer to make a covenant with Isaac, and he accepts. And he shows the same hospitality as his dad did. Look at verse 30. After they make the reason for their covenant, verse 30, it says, so he made them a feast, and he ate and drank, and they ate and drank. So he's showing them the same hospitality as his dad. And so here's another important thing to realize. Just as sin can be passed down to each generation, so can good actions as well. And I think that's the thing as parents that we can really hope for. At every turn, Abraham was hospitable. He was rushing around trying to take care of his guests. He made sure to go above and beyond what was needed. Remember when the three guests came to him and he runs to Sarah and says, quick, bake bread. There's nothing quick about that, right? But he's wanting to take care of their needs. Those kind of actions rub off. And we see this happening here with Isaac. He is being just as hospitable as his dad. It's a small point, and it's not one that is made in the passage, but it's given voice to from the passage. And so the covenant is made, and they depart in peace. And only afterwards is the report of a well being dug given to Isaac. He calls it Sheba, which literally means 7 in Hebrew. It's the number 7. And thus, it must have been the 7th well in the area. In fact, Beersheba means well of 7 in the Hebrew. So whenever you're counting, you go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, Sheba, 8, 9, 10. Okay? And you'll just impress people with your Hebrew knowledge. All right, and then in verses 34 to 35, the chapter ends on a low note. Esau takes 2 wives. Where are these wives from? The Hittites. Yeah. Now remember Abraham's concern in Genesis 24 that Isaac would not marry a Canaanite? Yeah, that he had to go all the way back to his family back in Mesopotamia and find a wife there and come back. Well, here it seems to be of no concern to Esau. And we see the problems that it gives. He and his wives made life bitter for Isaac and Rebekah. In the Hebrew, it literally says that they gave them grief of mind. So we're going to see this carry through into the next chapter. So I highlighted two things so far: generational sin and generational, I'll say, good things, good actions. But even for all the things that we do, there's still, again, that we're responsible for our own actions. And so even though Abraham made sure that Isaac had a wife from his own people, Esau is still charting new ground by just finding wives from the Canaanites, even though he shouldn't have done that. So that happens in our lives too. We can inherit things from our parents, but we can still do things on our own that have no connection to them. So the lessons for today: combat generational sin with confession and repentance. Good habits are passed down as well. And again, just God is faithful. He continues to work in these situations and continues to work across generations for his good. So that one's kind of short, but that's Genesis 26. Any questions or comments or insights into this chapter? Huh? You know, I thought of the exact same thing. Like, why would they do this? There was our wells that you can use. But I wonder if it had something to do with ownership. When they fill them back up, then that kind of cancels the ownership of those wells for Abraham and his descendants. You see that the I'm going to forget just the people of Gerar, the herdsmen of Gerar, quarreled about certain wells because they wanted ownership of that. So, yeah, maybe it's just an ownership thing, but still, yeah, I didn't understand that either. Yes. Right. So he's looking out, and he sees them laughing. Right. So there's a way that you laugh with people that you're just acquaintances with, and there's a way that you laugh with people that you know really well. So I can laugh with anyone here, and it's an authentic laugh, but it's a different laugh than the way I laugh with Katie, right? And so there's clues like that happening, I'm sure, just in his sight. But also, I believe that this is the same guy. This is Abimelech, and I'm sure he knew by now that Isaac looked very similar to Abraham. Or at least, probably he found out that he was Abraham's son. And so he's going to look out and he's going to see him with a person that he called his sister. And he's going to be like, I knew it. That's why. Any other questions, comments, insights? All right. That's all for tonight then. Thank you for coming.